The moment everything changed. It was supposed to be a perfect evening, a peaceful dinner with my husband Ethan, a meal I had spent hours preparing, hoping that tonight would be the night I could finally earn my mother-in-law Vivian's approval. After months of feeling like a failure in my own home, I had worked up the courage to share something so personal, something so important to me. But what should have been a joyous occasion turned into a nightmare. Ethan had always been the love of my life. From the moment we met, it felt like everything had fallen into place. I remember the first time I saw him. It was a Friday afternoon at Carter's coffee shop. I had been busy grading papers, as any third-grade teacher does before a weekend. The chaos of math worksheets and creative writing assignments didn't seem so overwhelming when Ethan spilled his coffee on them. His frantic attempt to salvage my students' homework had me laughing out loud. "I promise I'm not usually this clumsy," he said, desperately trying to dab away the coffee stains. "Let me make it up to you. How about coffee or maybe dinner?" That simple act of kindness had sparked a connection. We quickly became inseparable. Ethan was everything I dreamed of. Successful, humble, and responsible. He looked at me with such affection, as if I were the most fascinating person in the room, and for our first year of marriage, everything was perfect. We bought a small house with a garden and talked about the future, having kids, growing old together. But then, Vivian moved in. Ethan had assured me that it was only temporary, that his mother was having a hard time with her divorce and needed support. I tried to be understanding, but Vivian's presence in our home was suffocating. I could never do enough to please her. The house wasn't clean enough, the meals weren't up to her standards, and worst of all, I wasn't taking good enough care of her precious son. "She needs more protein than that," she'd comment, watching me pack his lunch. The comments seemed harmless at first, but over time, they started to wear me down. Ethan, who had once been so loving and supportive, began to change too. He started criticizing everything. The way I folded his shirts, how I prepared his meals, even how much time I spent talking to my sister on the phone. And behind every criticism was a whispered conversation with Vivian. That's when I started to feel the tension grow between us. But still, I tried. I tried to make everything perfect. The night I found out I was pregnant, 3 weeks ago, I had planned everything carefully. Ethan's favorite lasagna, the wine. Well, the wine I wouldn't be drinking, and a small surprise. I wanted easy to share the news. I wanted to tell him first, just the two of us, before Vivian could impose her opinions on the pregnancy. But Vivian had other plans. She insisted on joining us for dinner, stating, "Family dinners are important." The tension that had been building for months came to a head that evening. I overheard Vivian on the phone while I was in the kitchen preparing the lasagna. Her voice was sharp, filled with accusations. "She's hiding something. I saw her rushing to the bathroom at odd hours, probably having an affair. My Ethan deserves better than that." The blood drained from my face. An affair? How could she say something so cruel? My mind raced. What was she planning to whisper to Ethan now? What did she want him to believe about me? As Vivian entered the dining room, I placed the lasagna on the table with a smile, trying to maintain some semblance of calm. But the atmosphere was already heavy, and I could feel the weight of Vivian's suspicions pressing down on me. Ethan, who had always been kind and understanding, now seemed distant, as if he had already made up his mind about something I had no idea about. Then, as Vivian placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder and whispered something in his ear, I saw it, the shift in his face. His calm demeanor instantly changed to one of anger, his brows furrowing in confusion and disbelief. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, the unease growing within me. "Is this true?" Ethan demanded, his voice sharp, full of accusation. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping laudably against the floor. "Have you been lying to me?" Before I could even open my mouth to explain, Ethan's hand flew toward me. The slap was so sudden, so violent, I was knocked off balance, stumbling backward into the wall. My cheek burned with the sting of his hand, and the room seemed to spin. A wave of nausea and shock hit me all at once, and tears welled up in my eyes. And then, in front of both of them, I threw up. The smell of lasagna that had filled the room now made my stomach churn, and I could barely breathe. My vision blurred as I clutched my stomach, unable to comprehend what was happening. How could this be happening? Ethan froze, his face drained of color as he noticed something on the floor, a pregnancy test that had fallen out of my purse, its positive result glaring at him. He stared at the test, then at me, his eyes widening in shock. "Grace," he whispered shakily, his voice barely audible. Are you pregnant?" I touched my stinging cheek, my heart shattering in that moment. Tears streamed down my face as I whispered, "Yes, Ethan. I'm pregnant. I was going to tell you tonight. That's why I made your favorite dinner." The silence that followed felt suffocating. Ethan's gaze shifted from the pregnancy test to his own hand, the hand that had just struck me, the woman carrying his child. The shock on his face was unmistakable, but it wasn't just for me. It was for him too. It was as though the realization of what he had just done shattered something inside him. His mother's whispers had poisoned his thoughts, and in that moment, he saw me not as the woman he loved, but as something to be feared, something to be punished. The reckoning and the silent betrayal. The air in the room grew thick with tension, suffocating every breath that tried to escape my lungs. Time seemed to slow as I stood there, still reeling from the slap, my body trembling from the shock of it all. My hand instinctively went to my cheek, the sting of Ethan's strike still raw. But it wasn't just my cheek that hurt. My heart felt like it had been torn in two, and as I looked at Ethan's face, I saw nothing but a broken man, a man who had done something unspeakable and now had no idea how to fix it. The room, once filled with the warm, comforting aroma of lasagna and the soft hum of our conversations, had turned cold. Ethan stood frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief, the anger that had momentarily fueled his actions now replaced by confusion and regret. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His lips trembled as if he was trying to process what had just happened. Vivian, who had been standing off to the side with a smug look on her face, was now as still as a statue. She had been the catalyst for all of this, whispering poison into Ethan's ear, planting seeds of doubt that I hadn't even been able to recognize until it was too late. But now, the silence that hung between us felt deafening. Her perfect, painted lips were pressed into a thin line, and though her face was calm, I could see the shock in her eyes. This wasn't how she had imagined this night would unfold. She had orchestrated her plan, thinking that she would finally get her way. Her son believing her lies, and me, the outsider, being exposed for what she convinced him I was. I wanted to scream at her, to accuse her of everything I had endured under her manipulative presence in our home, but there was no strength left in me. All I could do was stand there, my tears falling freely, each one a reflection of the pain that had been building for months. The betrayal felt like a heavy weight in my chest, suffocating me, and the anger that had been bubbling inside me since the moment I overheard Vivian's cruel words on the phone felt like it was going to consume me. "Grace, please." Ethan's voice finally broke through the silence. It was shaky, filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. He reached out toward me, his hand trembling as he tried to close the distance between us, but I instinctively flinched away from him. It was as if his touch no longer held the warmth I once knew. Instead, it felt like a cold reminder of the man he had become in that one moment. A man who, just moments ago, had raised his hand against the woman carrying his child. "You slapped me," I whispered through trembling lips, my voice barely audible. "You slapped me, Ethan, while I'm carrying our baby." His face twisted in horror as the weight of his actions truly sank in. He stood there, staring at me as though he had just woken up from a nightmare, but the reality was far worse than any dream. I had hoped, so desperately, that I was wrong about his reactions, that he would see the truth of what I was feeling, and not let his mother's manipulations cloud his judgment. But now, the truth was undeniable. This was not the man I had fallen in love with. Grace, Ethan's voice faltered, and he swallowed hard, as if words couldn't express the regret and guilt flooding through him. His eyes never left mine, but there was nothing left of the man I knew. It was as if he had been replaced with a stranger who had just hurt me in the worst possible way. I didn't mean to. I didn't know. Grace, I thought. His words trailed off, unable to form any more coherent thought. I didn't know if he was talking to me or to himself, trying to find a way out of the suffocating guilt that was pressing down on him. The silence between us stretched on, each second an eternity. My body ached from the force of the slap, but it was my heart that was breaking. Ethan had been the one I trusted the most. I had always believed that no matter what, we would weather any storm together. But now, as I stood there, with tears blurring my vision and my head spinning, I couldn't help but question everything. Had I been wrong all along? Was this what my life was destined to become? A constant struggle to be seen and heard by the one person who was supposed to love me unconditionally. In the midst of my emotional turmoil, the door creaked open, and Chloe, our next-door neighbor, stepped inside. Her concerned face looked over the scene before her eyes rested on me, her gaze soft with sympathy and understanding. I heard shouting, Chloe said gently, her eyes scanning the room. She took in the sight of my red cheek, Ethan's guilty expression, and Vivian's tense posture, and she didn't need to ask what had happened. Her protective instincts kicked in immediately. Is everything okay? Chloe's voice was calm but firm as she took a step toward me, her arm reaching out to comfort me. Without waiting for an answer, she pulled me into her embrace, whispering softly, "Come with me, Grace." My heart was heavy, but Chloe's presence felt like a lifeline. She had been the one to listen to me, the one who had stood by my side when I needed someone the most. And now, as I felt my body weaken under the emotional strain, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone as I had felt. Chloe was right there, offering me the strength I had lost. "Chloe," I whispered, tears choking my words, "I don't know if I can go back to him. I don't know if I can forgive him after this." Chloe didn't answer right away. She just nodded, understanding that some wounds couldn't be healed with just words. And so, without another word, she wrapped her arm around me and guided me toward the door. As we stepped outside, the cold night air seemed to offer a brief respite, the chill on my skin mirroring the emptiness inside me. Ethan's voice called after me, desperate, filled with panic. "Grace, please. Don't go, please. Let me explain." But I didn't stop. His words no longer mattered. The man who had promised to love me, to protect me, had just shattered everything between us in a single violent act. And as the door closed behind me, I couldn't help but wonder how we had gotten here. How had things gone so terribly wrong? Chloe led me down the path to her home, a quiet sanctuary from the chaos I had just left behind. And as I walked away, I knew that the journey I was about to take wasn't just about healing from the hurt Ethan had caused. It was about finding the strength to rebuild my life on my own terms. The struggle to move forward. The days after I left Ethan's house were a blur of emotions. I stayed with Chloe for what felt like an eternity, but I knew that my life had shifted in a way that could never be undone. The warm glow of her home, the comforting sounds of her busy kitchen, and the constant reassurance from her didn't ease the weight that pressed down on my chest. It felt like I was carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders, the pain of betrayal, the fear of the future, and the uncertainty of everything that lay ahead. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling of Chloe's guest room, my mind raced through the events of the last few days. Ethan's face, filled with shock and horror after he realized what he had done, haunted me. But it wasn't just his face that lingered in my mind. It was the moment I saw him frozen, unable to comprehend the violence of his actions. For a brief, fleeting second, I had seen regret in his eyes, but the damage had already been done. The love I had once felt for him had been shattered, and no amount of regret could ever fix what had been broken. I was pregnant, That was the one truth that hadn't changed. And yet it felt like that secret, once meant to be a joyful revelation, had become a source of fear. My own husband, the man who was supposed to be my partner in everything, had turned on me because of a whispered lie. What had happened to the man I married? The Ethan who had held my hand through every difficult moment. The man who had promised to stand by me through thick and thin. And then there was Vivian. Her presence in our lives had always felt oppressive, but now it felt like a suffocating weight. It was clear to me now that she had been pulling strings behind the scenes, whispering doubts into Ethan's ear, planting seeds of mistrust that had flourished in the darkness of his insecurities. She was the puppet master, and I had been the one caught in the crossfire of her schemes. The realization of how deep her influence had run made me feel both betrayed and humiliated. Chloe sat with me every day, listening to me cry, offering words of comfort when I had none. I had never truly realized the depth of our friendship until now. Chloe, who had always been the quiet observer in our relationship, now became my rock. "Grace, you're not alone in this," she would remind me. "I know it feels like everything's falling apart, but you're stronger than this. You will find a way to move forward." But how? How was I supposed to move forward when everything I had known had been turned upside down? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan's face, the hurt in his eyes when he realized the depth of what he had done. But that hurt wasn't enough to take away the violence, the slap that still burned on my cheek, and the crushing feeling that this marriage might not survive. Could I ever trust him again? Could I ever forgive him for what he had done to me and our baby? My phone rang one morning while I was sitting in the kitchen, sipping on a cup of tea. Chloe had gone out for errands, and I was left alone with my thoughts. It was Ethan. I had been avoiding his calls, letting them go to voicemail. But this time, something inside me stirred, and I pressed the button to answer. "Grace, please, just let me explain. I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I don't know what came over me. Please, please talk to me." His voice was shaky, full of fear and regret, but I couldn't bring myself to feel pity for him. It was too much too late. The anger inside me flared up again, but this time, it wasn't just about the slap. It was about everything. The lies, the manipulations, the doubts that Vivian had planted in his mind. "Ethan," I said softly, my voice filled with a calmness I didn't feel. "You don't get to hurt me like that and expect me to just forgive you. You don't get to just walk back into my life after what you did." "I know," he replied, his voice trembling. "I know I messed up. I should never have let her." "Enough," I interrupted. "You don't get to blame her. You made a choice. You chose to believe her lies over me. You chose to hurt me. And I'm done. I don't know what's left of us, but I do know that I can't go back to the way things were. I can't." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could feel his desperation even through the phone, but I also felt a certain peace that I hadn't experienced in days. Maybe it was the certainty of knowing that I wasn't weak, that I had strength within me I never realized I had. Maybe it was the realization that I was worthy of more than this, a life of love, trust, and respect. "I understand," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you can't forgive me, I'll respect that. But I'll always love you, Grace, always." The words hit me hard, but I knew that love wasn't enough to heal this wound. The damage had been done, and I couldn't live in the shadow of it any longer. I hung up the phone and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the conversation settle inside me. I wasn't sure what would happen next, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let this define me. I wasn't going to stay in a relationship where I felt unworthy of respect and love. The phone call was a turning point. It marked the moment when I truly began to understand that I couldn't keep living in fear. I couldn't keep hiding from the reality of what had happened. It was time to reclaim my life, to heal, and to embrace the strength that was already within me. Ethan may have been part of my past, but I was moving forward. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the right path. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, But I knew that I wasn't alone. And that thought, for the first time, gave me hope. The road to healing. The days after my conversation with Ethan were a blur, but each passing day brought a little more clarity. The world seemed both colder and warmer all at once. The hurt was still there, an aching reminder of everything that had gone wrong, but the path forward was slowly beginning to reveal itself. I was in a place of both loss and rebirth, a crossroads where I had to decide who I was going to be, not just for myself, but for the child growing inside me. The love I had once shared with Ethan, so pure and promising, now felt like an ancient memory. It was hard to reconcile the man I had married with the one who had raised his hand to me, who had doubted me in the most painful way. But as I reflected on what had happened, I began to realize that forgiveness didn't mean returning to the past. It didn't mean pretending things could go back to how they were before. Forgiveness, I found, was for me, not for Ethan. It was a way to free myself from the grip of anger and hurt, a way to reclaim my power. One afternoon, after spending days at Chloe's house, I felt the weight of the silence around me. Chloe had been incredible, providing me with both physical and emotional support, but there was something missing. The ache in my heart, the heaviness of uncertainty, had not fully lifted. I missed my home. I missed the life I had built with Ethan, even if it had been tainted by the shadows of doubt and pain. It wasn't the life I wanted now, but it was the life I had once cherished. So I decided to go back. Not for Ethan, not even for Vivian, but for me. I packed my things, taking only what I needed, and returned to the house where it all began. My heart pounded as I walked through the door, but the familiar warmth of the place, its worn walls and faded curtains, didn't seem as suffocating as it once did. It was just a house, a structure. I wasn't going to let the memories of what had happened there define me anymore. The first few days were quiet, reflective. I focused on myself. I began to go back to the things I loved: reading, journaling, and walking through the park. It felt good to reconnect with myself, to breathe without the weight of anxiety pressing down on me. Then came the moment I had been dreading, the one I hadn't fully prepared for. Ethan showed up at the door. I knew it was inevitable, but still my stomach twisted with nerves as I opened it. He stood there, the same man I had once married, but now there was something different about him. He looked tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. His eyes were heavy with regret, with sorrow for what he had done. I knew he had been calling, leaving messages, but I had let them go unanswered. I wasn't ready. "Grace," he said softly, his voice shaky. "I know I've lost you. I can't undo what I've done. But I need to say this. I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that I was wrong. I hurt you in the worst way possible, and I'll carry that guilt with me forever. But if you ever change your mind, if you ever feel like there's a chance for us, I'm here." His words hung in the air between us, and for a long moment I couldn't find the words to respond. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't sad. I was just quiet. The silence stretched on, but then the realization hit me. I didn't need his apology to move on. I didn't need his permission to be whole again. I had already begun to heal, and in this moment, I understood that true healing came from within, not from the person who had caused the pain. "I appreciate your words, Ethan," I finally said, my voice calm, steady. "But I'm not the same person I was. I've had to find a new path, one that's just for me. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that I can't go back to the way things were." Ethan's face fell, but he nodded, as if he had already expected this answer. "I understand," he whispered, taking a step back. "I just wanted you to know that I'll always love you, and I'll always be sorry for what I did." With that, he turned and walked away. It wasn't a grand farewell, but it was enough. It was final. And as I watched him leave, something shifted inside me. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel bitter. I felt free. The next few months were filled with a new kind of peace. I focused on my pregnancy, on preparing for the life I was about to bring into the world. I surrounded myself with supportive friends, people who understood that healing takes time, and that forgiveness is a choice, not a requirement. My relationship with Chloe deepened even further. She was my strength, my unwavering pillar, and I was grateful for her every day. When my baby was born, a beautiful little girl, I looked at her and realized how far I had come. I had survived the storm, and now I was building something new. My past no longer held me in its grip. It no longer defined who I was or what my future would be. I was writing my own story, one where I was the hero. And for the first time in a long time, I understood what true strength was. It wasn't about never falling. It was about getting back up, no matter how many times life knocked you down. It was about knowing your worth, even when others tried to make you feel small. As I looked at my daughter, my heart swelled with hope. I would teach her everything I had learned about love, about strength, and about resilience. And when the time came for her to write her own story, I knew she would write it with the courage to stand up for herself, just as I had done. It wasn't just a new chapter. It was a whole new book, one filled with possibilities, dreams, and the unwavering promise that no matter what happened, I would always be enough. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.